Hello and welcome back to the channel and to another episode of the Off Season, a new series where I share a bit about what's going on with my personal cars. On this episode, I'm making a solid mount for the GT4 lip that I have on the ISF. Although this thing is probably large enough to be considered a splitter, the company markets it as a lip. I was a bit naive at how much downforce it makes, and the last time I drove at Button Willow, the lip ended up pulling the washers through the bumper tabs, so I figured now was as good a time as any to make a proper mount for it. There's several ways to go about this, but I found that this particular way made the most sense to me, and if you have any suggestions or questions about it, feel free to leave them below. And a few weeks ago I made some modifications to the radiator support to allow the aluminum uprights I'm using to mount at a perfect 90-degree angle to the splitter. I also rerouted the transmission cooler lines and oil cooler lines on the opposite side, so if I went off track and the mount twisted or broke, it wouldn't compromise the lines by tearing them. Once you have a general idea of where you want things to be mounted on the chassis, it's a pretty simple job to make this, but I started with taking several measurements and just kind of went from there. It's not on camera, but I probably mounted the splitter temporarily a couple dozen times before I started cutting or drilling anything permanent, just so I know that I had it set up properly. To mount the uprights to the splitter, I'm using this angled aluminum. These pieces ended up being a little too short, so I replaced them with longer pieces that reach the end of the splitter for more stability. You'll see that a little bit later in the episode. Here you get a general idea of what the mount looks like. I'm mounting it temporarily with just some M6 hardware and little washers. These will eventually be replaced by 2.5 or 3-inch washers. And now that everything's bolted up, I'm going to line the splitter up with the car again to double check the angle and height. This way I can make the final measurements for the uprights and ensure that I leave some room for adjustment later on if anything changes. I had to slightly bend that air conditioning line to fit the 4-inch wide upright on the inside. There wasn't really any way to avoid having it on the outside of the upright without heavy modification to the AC line, which I really didn't want to do. This is really the only part of this setup that bothers me. After more measurements and drilling, it was time to remove the bumper support mounts to drill them for the rib nuts. I'm going to use 4 M8 bolts on each side to hold the uprights to the mounts. The next day, before cleaning up all the cuts and holes, I threw the bumper back on and took it for a quick test drive. I was still waiting on some back-ordered splitter rods to arrive for each of the sides, but I wanted to see if I needed to make any major adjustments to the mount itself. That's when I discovered that the angled aluminum I used was much too short, causing the lip to buffet at anything higher than 40 miles per hour. So while I waited for the longer aluminum to arrive, I reinforced the front of the splitter to the bumper just so that I could drive the car a little bit more at faster speeds. I wanted to get an idea of how bad the lip was flexing, so I had Natalie film the car from the outside while I drove it on the freeway. But it was pretty dark by the time we got down the hill, so it was difficult to see. Anyway, I think with the longer aluminum on each end, it should be okay. A week or so later, I received the new aluminum pieces and was able to get them trimmed and mounted to the splitter. The longer supports made the stability improved quite a bit, and as you can see, this is about as far forward as I can get the mounts given the unique shape of the lip. I also ended up cutting most of the bumper under tray off. It wasn't really needed anymore, and now the bumper mostly just rests on the splitter.